This documentary was researched and created for the NPA Level 6 Zoo Animal Behaviour and Welfare course of 2021 to 2022. This documentary will cover a range of topics from how these animals live in the wild, how zoos mimic their natural habitats and eating procedures, as well as looking into the laws, standards and roles required to successfully run a zoo today. The Lar gibbons will be the focus animal type for the majority of this documentary, touching on what is required for them to successfully thrive in captivity. The European wolves will be discussed slightly later in the documentary as the carnivorous species, the Lar gibbons being omnivores. Much like animal circus shows, zoos were an entertainment-based scheme when they started. No real thought or planning was put into how the animals were actually treated. Zoos can be categorized in three periods: pre-modern, ranging from ancient times up to 1750, modern times between 1750 and 1950, and finally present day, which is from the 1950s up till currently. During pre-modern and modern times, zoos were essentially animal prisons. It wasn't until 1965 when a committee led by Professor Roger Bramble produced an 85-page report regarding the welfare of livestock that there was any significant improvements to animals' welfare. This report stated what should be the minimum requirements that an organisation housing caged animals should provide. The ability to stand up, lie down, turn around and groom themselves. These were what the report stated all caged animals should have the ability to do. These standards were later known as Bramble's 5 Freedoms. These freedoms became almost a guideline for the minimum requirements for what zoos should provide. The freedom from hunger and thirst, freedoms from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury and disease, freedom to express normal behaviour and freedoms from fear and distress. Since the introduction of the 5 freedoms, zoos have become well-structured organisations focused on education, conservation and animal welfare. Implementing strict government legislation into animal organisations such as zoos and animal shelters have made welfare one of the primary focuses of any animal organisation. Some examples of legislation which must be followed are Zoo Licensing Act 1981, the Bali Directive and the Animal Welfare Act 2006. Optional organisations can team up with zoos, such as IAZA, who aid European and Middle Eastern zoos and aquariums with research and conservation, DEFRA, who cover environmental, food and rural affairs, and BIAZA, representing zoos and aquariums as a professional body. Zookeepers are animal professionals involved in managing and maintaining animals, their environments and their general welfare. Zookeepers have many roles besides keeping animals watered and fed. Some of these include zoo maintenance, conducting health checks, administering medication when necessary, and educating the public through events, open days and talks, as well as record keeping. Record keeping and welfare checks are used to keep track of animals' health and welfare conditions. Records may be kept regarding enclosure safety, animals' nutritional information, any allergies the animal may have, medical conditions they could have, medication the animal needs for those conditions, and their breeding histories. Some of the record-keeping methods used by zoos are ZIMs, EAP, and ESBs. The Lar gibbons are an endangered primate in the gibbon family. They can be found in the tropical and subtropical forests of Southeast Asia, mainly in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Living in moist and dry-leafed areas, they live in small groups, staying high in the trees, looking for food, caring for their young, and keeping away from most predators on the ground. Lar gibbons are omnivores, eating both plants and meat. Lar gibbons' diets typically consist of leafy plants, flowers, insects, and pieces of fruit found in the trees, although they have been known to eat bird eggs and even smaller animals. Although about 75% of a gibbon's diet typically consists of fruit. Most hours of the day consist of eating and the rest being from foraging. At Camperdown, the Lar gibbons are fed 3 times a day. In the morning, they receive 2 peppers, 2 apples, a carrot, 2 kiwis or plums, and 2 handfuls of greens. At lunchtime, it's 2 peppers, 2 handfuls of greens, and 150 grams of seasonal fruit. And their last feed is 2 pears, 1 carrot, 3 large handfuls of veg. This could be sweet corn, aubergines, sweet potatoes, butternut squash, or beetroot. The gibbon's food is placed on wooden platforms about 1.5 metres off the ground, spread out throughout the enclosure to keep the food clean, to encourage natural behaviour of staying higher up. This mimics the gibbon's natural wild behaviour by keeping them up high, staying out of the reach of predators in the higher trees. Food rarely gets scattered around in case the food is left, leaving room for rodent infestation. Mimicking the gibbon's natural environment when in captivity is very important. The gibbon's enclosure is enriched with bushes, ropes, branches and wooden beams to allow them to stay above the ground and swing around freely like they would in the wild. Ensuring good welfare is vital. Poor welfare can have numerous negative effects of the animals. Below are some indicators of good and bad animal welfare. If the zoo staff fail to provide appropriate welfare, this could lead to uncharacteristic behaviours in the gibbons. Uncharacteristic behaviours can be caused by several different factors, such as unsuitable enclosures, this could be the size or the type of enclosure, little to no enrichment, lack of food and water, unsuitable diet, or undiscovered illnesses. Many animals are social in the wild. These type of animals require a partner or other member of their species for company. Failure to provide this could lead to depression or anxiety-related issues. Some typical signs of uncharacteristic behaviours are shown below. Prevention methods for these would be providing sufficient food or water alongside the specific dietary requirements being met, companions being provided for social animal species at the zoos, animal enclosures must be appropriately sized and safe, providing room to roam and exercise. Shelters should also have an area which offers shelter from the weather and public view, which enrichment should be provided for entertainment to encourage natural behaviour and avoid boredom. Some examples of uncharacteristic behaviours in the Lar gibbons are rocking back and forth, twitching, scraping their teeth, or repetitive swinging without travelling any distance. Our carnivorous species, the grey wolves, some examples of them would be pacing, depression, continuous salivating, aggressive behaviours, and a general look of lethargy.
On the topic of animal welfare, welfare sheets are kept and regularly updated to ensure each enclosure is sufficient in providing the animals with everything that they require in order to maintain optimal welfare, ensuring that the animals are in good physical health, stimulated both mentally and socially. Below is an example of a very small and short welfare sheet. Welfare sheets can have varying degrees of detail, but this is just for a rough example. This welfare sheet showed that the staff members at Camperdown do an amazing job in providing the gibbons with a safe and clean enclosure, providing them with appropriate environment, diet, and entertainment, resulting in happy and healthy animals. The Camperdown enclosure provides the Lar gibbons with numerous ropes, beams, and swings for them to swing, hang, and run across, allowing fast and easy movement around the enclosure. This keeps the gibbons active and healthy, mimics how they would actually travel in the wild, and it keeps them entertained when they'll regularly be seen chasing and playing around with each other. As expected, being at Camperdown, the gibbons are fed healthy and appropriate food, and they have water bottles in their caged area around the back of their sheltered shed, providing fresh, clean water. The ground of the enclosure has coverage in the form of grass and bushes, like the forests in the wild that the gibbons would be used to seeing. There are not many real branches or trees inside the enclosure, which is the only drawback of the enclosure. This problem is expected though, as it's not very spectator friendly to have tall trees blocking the public's view of the gibbons. The ropes and the beams added by the Camperdown staff do solve this problem anyway. The gibbons do have shelter away from the weather, a small shed that they can sleep. This does not offer peace from the public's view, however. The gibbons would have to use the caged area at the back of the shed for that. However, this does not offer shelter from the weather, so ideally there would be something added later on which provides a separation from the public and from the weather.
Hand rearing is done when the infant animal is not ready to be released into the wild or into captivity yet. It will be used if an animal's parents are dead or reject the infant, if the animal needs medical care, or if the keepers feel the animal is in danger from other members of the pack or even its parents. Hand rearing can cause negative effects. Hand rearing can cause behavioural changes to an animal. It could become too comfortable in human care, causing rejection from the pack when it eventually returns, or these behaviours can be interpreted by the other pack members, spreading uncharacteristic behaviours amongst the entire pack. These risks are why hand rearing is only done as a last resort.
Our class was tasked to build an enrichment for our chosen animals that would get them interacting with it, challenging them or amusing them. To collect data for the gibbons, we used ethograms. These were used to record the animal's behaviours, dates of when the behaviour was conducted, the weather of the day, and what time of the day it was gathered, as these are all factors that can affect how the gibbons would act. The ethogram being shown was my pre-enrichment ethogram, showing me how the gibbons generally behaved on a day-to-day basis, what behaviours were common, how they acted with each other, with the public, did they play often, did they relax most of the time, things of this nature. When gathering my information, I used 4 one-hour-long ethograms on 4 separate days, all at 1 p.m, for the evidence to base my results on. 2 ethograms were before enrichment was added, the other 2 were after it was added, to compare and see what behaviours changed, increased or decreased, and see how much the enrichment affected them, if at all. Behaviours were listed on the ethogram and counted over a 1-hour observation. If a behaviour was performed, it was ticked for the 5-minute window. If it was performed again over the next 5 minutes, it would be ticked again, and so on in 5-minute sections until an hour was reached. Before we began planning our enrichment, we were told that the Lar Gibbons became extremely stressed when the staff members entered their enclosure. We were recommended to think of an enrichment idea which could be used and interacted with without us going inside the animal's enclosure. We wanted our enrichment to force the Gibbons to have to use their minds and their bodies to work for their food, just like in the wild. The drawing being shown is one of our rough sketch ideas of how our enrichment would look and work. The wooden beam would be placed on the outside of the animal's enclosure. 4 pieces of rope would be descended from the wood, the holes being cut by the use of a bone saw. At the bottom of the ropes, milk jugs would be attached, these milk jugs having holes in them filled with newspaper and fruit for the animals to access. The idea being had to force the Gibbons to crawl up the inside of the enclosure, stretch through using their arms and hand-eye coordination to try and manipulate and move the milk jugs around to try and access the food, forcing them to use their brains and their physicality, just like in the wild. We initially looked for something more substantial and weighty than milk jugs to have at the end of the ropes. We had a couple of looks inside Pets for Homes and other shops, but we couldn't find anything. Ideally, we were looking for a ball-shaped item which already had holes or shapes cut into it that the Gibbons could have just reached into and we could have just attached to the ropes without having to make it from scratch. Due to the male Gibbon, Malachi, becoming aggressive with the staff member who attempted to attach our enrichment to the outside of the enclosure, we had to think about where else we were going to attach the enrichment without putting any of the staff members in danger. Our only option was to attach it inside their shed area where they sleep. Having the enrichment inside this shed area reduced the difficulty of obtaining the food almost entirely, but it was our only option with only a few weeks remaining. The Lar Gibbons themselves did make the enrichment process very, very difficult. In the end, our enrichment wasn't particularly challenging mentally or physically to the Gibbons, or at least not in the way that we all planned. Despite this, once Malachi eventually calmed down and started interacting with the enrichment, he seemed to be quite amused. The footage being shown is his first interaction with the enrichment. We now had everything in place to create our post-enrichment ethograms and see what effect the enrichments had had on the Lar Gibbons. After observing and analysing the Gibbons on how they behaved, we were now able to come up with our hypothesis. My hypothesis was on average number of interactions with the enrichment would be significant, averaging 8 interactions in a 1-hour period. Hanging, swinging and playing behaviours would also increase. After going through the post-enrichment data, it was found that there was significant interest in the enrichment by the Gibbons, being interacted with 9 times per hour on average. Hanging and playing behaviours both increased, hanging by 2.0 and playing by 2.5 on average. However, swinging did not increase, in fact dropping by 1.0 on average, which goes against what was hypothesised. Overall, this would be categorised as a fairly productive process. Despite the issues, the enrichment seemed to entertain the Gibbons, despite not being what was planned, and it significantly increased how much time the Gibbons actually spent hanging around playing together as a family, which is always good readings as an animal lover. Lastly, I just want to say special thanks to all the college lecturers who helped us throughout this year, and all the staff at Camperdown. Thank you very much.
Schöne Sache.